The day started like any other in the bustling office of Sterling Enterprises. Employees scurried about, clutching coffee cups and folders, their chatter drowned out by the hum of ringing phones and tapping keyboards. At the corner office, Mark Bennett, the company's regional manager, reviewed his notes for the morning meeting. Mark was known for being a no-nonsense leader, efficient, goal-driven, and, some would argue, unapproachable. Meanwhile, in a cubicle just a few steps away from the corner office sat James Carter, a senior analyst who had been with the company for over 6 years. James had a reputation for being meticulous, innovative, and a natural leader among his peers. He had consistently exceeded expectations, contributing to some of the company's biggest successes. Today, however, James wasn't thinking about spreadsheets or quarterly goals. He was thinking about the promotion he had applied for, the position of team lead, one that he knew he was more than qualified for. When the meeting started, Mark announced the promotion. To James's shock, the position was given to another candidate, a younger, less experienced employee. The room erupted in polite applause, but James sat frozen, his mind racing. Later that day, James confronted Mark in his office. "Mark, I've worked here for years. My track record speaks for itself. I need to understand why I wasn't chosen for the promotion." Mark leaned back in his chair, avoiding James's gaze. "It's not personal, James. We felt that Alex was a better fit for the role." James frowned. "A better fit? Alex has been here for less than 2 years. I've led projects that brought in millions for this company. How can you say I'm not qualified?" Mark hesitated, then said, "Look, James, you're good at what you do. But leadership is about more than just numbers." The words stung. They were vague and dismissive, leaving James with the sinking feeling that there was more to the decision than Mark was willing to admit. That night, James sat at his kitchen table, replaying the conversation in his head. He thought about the times his ideas had been ignored in meetings, only to be praised when someone else presented them. He thought about the subtle comments, the jokes, and the way his accomplishments were often downplayed. For the first time, he allowed himself to name the feeling he had been suppressing. This wasn't just unfair, it was racial bias. On the other side of town, Mark sat in his own kitchen, nursing a glass of whiskey. He told himself he had made the right decision, but an uneasy feeling lingered. For some reason, James's words, his determination, his disappointment, kept replaying in his mind. The days that followed were a mix of tension and reflection for both James and Mark. For James, every glance at Alex, the new team lead, felt like a reminder of what he had been denied. Not because of his skills, but because of something deeper. His colleagues offered half-hearted words of sympathy, but no one dared address the real issue. James began to wonder if his efforts and loyalty to the company had ever truly mattered. Determined to understand the root of the problem, James requested a formal meeting with Mark. When the meeting began, James came prepared. He laid out his contributions to the company over the years, successful projects, team leadership in crunch times, and accolades from clients. He asked the question that had been burning inside him. "Mark, was it because I'm black?" Mark froze. The directness of the question made him uncomfortable, and it showed. "James, I don't think that's a fair accusation," he stammered. "This isn't about race. It's about finding the right fit for the role." "Then what makes me the wrong fit?" James countered. "Because when I look at my track record, I see results. I see leadership. The only thing I don't see is fairness." Mark's silence spoke volumes. He mumbled something about company culture and expectations, but James wasn't buying it. The conversation ended with no clear resolution, and James left the office feeling angrier than ever. At home, James confided in his wife, Mia, who had heard these stories one too many times. "It's always the same," she said, shaking her head. "They want your work, your ideas, your energy, but when it's time to acknowledge your value, suddenly there's an excuse." Mia's words ignited a fire in James. He decided to take action, but he knew he had to be strategic. He began researching workplace discrimination laws and reached out to a mentor, Karen, a retired HR executive who had always been a voice of reason in his life. "James, I won't lie to you," Karen said during their call. "Proving bias is difficult. But what you can do is document everything. If there's a pattern, you'll have something to stand on." Karen's advice gave James clarity. He began keeping a journal of incidents, noting every time he felt overlooked or undervalued. He also started speaking discreetly with colleagues, asking if they had noticed similar patterns. To his surprise, several of them admitted they had witnessed or experienced bias themselves but were too afraid to speak up. Meanwhile, Mark found himself grappling with unexpected doubts. His wife, Susan, noticed his unusual mood one evening and asked, "What's going on with you?" Mark sighed. "It's this thing at work. One of my employees, James, thinks I didn't promote him because of his race. And why didn't you promote him?" Susan asked bluntly. Mark frowned. "I don't know. I mean, Alex just seemed like a better fit." Susan raised an eyebrow. "Better fit or easier choice?" "Mark, have you ever really thought about the dynamics in your office? About what it means to lead a diverse team?" Her words stuck with Mark. That night, he started reading about unconscious bias, a term he had heard before but never truly considered. The more he read, the more uncomfortable he became. He began to see how small, seemingly harmless decisions could perpetuate inequality. He thought back to the times he had dismissed James's ideas, not because they weren't good, but because they came from someone he hadn't fully learned to value. Back at the office, tension continued to build. James noticed subtle shifts in how people interacted with him. Some were supportive, while others avoided him altogether. Word had spread about his confrontation with Mark, and opinions were divided. One day, during a team meeting, Alex presented an idea for a new project, a concept James had proposed months earlier but had been brushed aside. The room went silent as James spoke up. "Funny, that sounds a lot like what I suggested back in March. Does anyone else remember that?" Mark's face flushed. It was a small moment, but it exposed a larger truth. James had been overlooked in more ways than one. By the end of the day, Mark called James into his office again. "James, I've been thinking about our last conversation," he began, his tone unusually humble. "I realize I might have made some mistakes." James looked at him, skeptical but curious. "What kind of mistakes?" "I think I've been blind to certain biases," Mark admitted. "I can't change what's already happened, but I want to do better moving forward. I'd like to work with you to address some of these issues in our workplace." James leaned back in his chair, unsure whether to believe Mark's words. "This isn't just about me, Mark. It's about everyone in this company who feels like their contributions are overlooked because of who they are." Mark nodded. "I understand. Let's start with a conversation, and from there action." For James, it was a small step, but it felt like progress. In the weeks that followed, James and Mark began navigating an uneasy alliance. Mark proposed creating a task force to address workplace inclusivity, and though James appreciated the gesture, he wasn't convinced it was more than a superficial attempt to save face. Still, James agreed, on one condition. The group wouldn't just be for appearances. It would need clear goals, real data, and actionable outcomes. The first meeting of the task force was tense. Employees were invited to share their experiences anonymously, and the results were sobering. Stories of overlooked promotions, biased evaluations, and a general lack of representation at leadership levels poured in. Mark sat quietly as the stories were read aloud, each one chipping away at the defenses he had built around himself. For the first time, he was forced to confront the culture he had been complicit in creating. One story, in particular, stood out. A longtime employee described how they had stopped sharing ideas in meetings because they felt their input was always ignored or dismissed. "It's not that I don't care," the anonymous writer concluded. "It's that I'm tired of caring and being met with silence." Mark recognized the weight of those words. He thought back to James and how many times he had subconsciously dismissed his ideas, assuming they lacked merit without fully considering them. The task force had only just begun, but already, Mark could see how much work lay ahead. While the task force worked on gathering feedback and proposing initiatives, James took a different approach. He began reaching out to colleagues from other companies who had faced similar struggles, looking for advice and inspiration. One of his contacts introduced him to Lisa Hernandez, the head of diversity and inclusion at a major firm. Lisa's organization had transformed its workplace culture over the past 5 years, and James was eager to learn how they had done it. "Change doesn't happen overnight," Lisa said during their video call. It takes commitment at every level, but especially from leadership. It's not just about policies, it's about mindset. You have to make people see what they've been blind to. Lisa shared strategies that had worked for her company, including implicit bias training, mentorship programs for underrepresented employees, and transparent promotion criteria. James took detailed notes, determined to bring these ideas back to the task force. He knew that if Mark was serious about making changes, they would need a concrete plan, not just vague promises. Meanwhile, Mark's journey of self-reflection continued. He began attending workshops on diversity and inclusion, something he never would have considered before. At first, he felt defensive, like he was being accused of something he didn't fully understand. But as the sessions progressed, Mark started to see himself in the examples being discussed. He realized that bias wasn't always overt or malicious. Sometimes, it was as simple as gravitating toward people who looked or thought like him. One night, Mark stayed late in the office, poring over employee performance reviews. He compared James's file with Alex's and felt a pang of guilt. On paper, James was clearly the stronger candidate for the team lead role. His accomplishments, his leadership skills, and his experience all pointed to someone who deserved the promotion. Mark couldn't deny it anymore. He had made the wrong decision, and it wasn't just an oversight. It was a reflection of his own blind spots. The turning point came during a company-wide meeting where Mark addressed the results of the task force's findings. Standing in front of his employees, he felt a knot of anxiety in his stomach. But he knew this was a moment that couldn't be avoided. "I want to start by saying that I've made mistakes," Mark began, his voice steady but earnest. "I've let my own biases influence decisions, and for that, I take full responsibility. This isn't just about one person or one incident. It's about the culture we've all contributed to, whether intentionally or not." He paused, scanning the room. Some faces looked skeptical, others surprised. James watched from the back, arms crossed, wondering if Mark's words would translate into real change. "We're not just going to talk about inclusivity, we're going to act on it," Mark continued. "Starting today, we're implementing clear guidelines for promotions, mandatory bias training for all managers, and a mentorship program to support underrepresented employees. And I want to personally invite anyone who feels overlooked or unheard to come talk to me. No judgment, no defensiveness, just a conversation." The room was silent for a moment before scattered applause broke out. James didn't clap. He wasn't ready to trust Mark's intentions just yet, but he couldn't deny that the announcement felt like a step in the right direction. Later that day, Mark approached James in the break room. "I hope you'll be part of the mentorship program," he said, his tone softer than usual. "You'd make an incredible mentor." James raised an eyebrow. "I'll consider it. But first, let's see if this is more than just words." Mark nodded. "Fair enough." For the first time, their conversation didn't feel like a power struggle. It felt like the beginning of something new. The changes at Sterling Enterprises didn't happen all at once, but the shift in tone was undeniable. Mark's announcement set the stage for real transformation, and James made it his mission to ensure the promises were more than just corporate lip service. The mentorship program was the first tangible step. James, along with other senior employees, volunteered to mentor junior staff members from underrepresented backgrounds. The program was structured to provide not only career advice but also advocacy, ensuring that talented employees wouldn't be overlooked in the way James had been. James's mentee, a young analyst named Aisha, reminded him of himself when he first joined the company, eager, capable, and determined to make an impact. Their conversations became a source of inspiration for James, showing him the importance of creating opportunities for the next generation. Meanwhile, the task force implemented monthly workshops on unconscious bias, cultural competency, and equitable leadership. The first sessions were met with mixed reactions. Some employees embraced the learning, while others bristled at the idea of being called out. Mark attended every session, often sitting in silence as employees shared painful stories of exclusion and bias. For him, these workshops became a mirror, forcing him to confront the ways he had contributed to the problem. One workshop focused on the concept of microaggressions, subtle, often unintentional comments or actions that reinforce stereotypes. During the session, a facilitator asked the group to reflect on times they might have dismissed someone's perspective because of assumptions about their background. Mark hesitated, then raised his hand. I've done this, he admitted. I've dismissed ideas from people on my team because I didn't see them as leaders. I told myself it wasn't personal, but the truth is, I was wrong. His admission was met with silence, followed by cautious nods. It was a small moment, but it signaled to the team that change was possible, even for those who had been part of the problem. James, on the other hand, found himself growing into a new role. Not the team lead he had hoped for, but a different kind of leader. Colleagues began seeking him out for advice and guidance, seeing him as a voice for fairness and integrity. This unofficial leadership gave James a renewed sense of purpose, though it didn't erase the sting of being overlooked. One day, during a task force meeting, James presented a proposal inspired by his conversation with Lisa Hernandez. We need more than just mentorship and workshops, he said. We need transparency. Let's publish clear criteria for promotions, so everyone knows what's expected and can hold leadership accountable. The proposal sparked debate, but Mark ultimately supported it. Within weeks, the company rolled out new guidelines for performance evaluations and promotions. The criteria were objective, measurable, and designed to eliminate bias. For the first time, employees felt like the playing field might actually be leveling. The transformation wasn't without its challenges. Some employees resisted the changes, claiming the company was focusing too much on diversity at the expense of merit. These voices grew louder when James was nominated for a special leadership development program, one designed to prepare high-potential employees for executive roles. When James learned of his nomination, he hesitated. Part of him felt vindicated. This was the recognition he had always deserved. But another part worried about how it would be perceived. Would people think he got in because of the new focus on diversity rather than his actual abilities? He confided in Mia, who didn't mince words. James, you've earned this. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise. Let your work speak for itself, like it always has. Encouraged by her words, James accepted the nomination. The program became a turning point for him, providing tools and strategies to navigate the complexities of leadership. It also gave him a new network of peers who shared his experiences and struggles, reminding him that he wasn't alone in this journey. For Mark, the changes were personal as well as professional. He began holding one-on-one meetings with employees, seeking their input and feedback in a way he never had before. During one of these meetings, James confronted him with a simple but powerful question. Mark, do you really believe I deserved that promotion back then? Mark didn't hesitate this time. Yes, James, you did. And I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. The apology was long overdue, but it marked a shift in their relationship. Mark began relying on James as a trusted advisor, often asking for his perspective on team decisions. Though their dynamic was still complicated, it was clear they had moved from adversaries to something closer to allies. By the end of the year, the impact of the changes at Sterling Enterprises was undeniable. Employee engagement scores had risen, and turnover rates had dropped significantly. More importantly, the workplace felt different. People like James, people who had once been overlooked or undervalued, were finally being recognized for their contributions. One day, as James walked past Mark's office, Mark called him in. James, there's something I want you to see, he said, handing over a draft of the company's annual report. The report highlighted the progress the company had made toward inclusivity, but what caught James's eye was a small section titled Voices of Change. It featured a photo of James, along with a quote, "Leadership isn't about titles. It's about lifting others up and creating space for everyone to succeed." James looked up at Mark, who shrugged. I thought it was fitting. For the first time in a long time, James felt seen, not just as an employee, but as a leader in his own right. A year later, Sterling Enterprises was a different company. The changes implemented by the task force had become woven into the organization's culture, and employees from all backgrounds felt more empowered to share their ideas, speak up about challenges, and pursue leadership roles. For James, the journey had been transformative. The leadership development program he completed opened new doors, and his confidence as a leader grew with every new challenge he tackled. When a senior management position opened in another department, James was not only considered for the role but also chosen for it unanimously. This time, there was no hesitation, no second-guessing of his abilities. only recognition of his hard work, vision, and dedication. Mark personally announced James's promotion during a company-wide meeting. "When we talk about leadership at Sterling, we're talking about people like James," he said, a genuine pride in his voice. "He's shown us what it means to challenge the status quo, to lead with integrity, and to inspire change, not just for himself but for everyone around him." The applause was louder than James had expected. He stood, momentarily overwhelmed, and then gave a short speech. "This isn't just about me," he began. "It's about what we've built together. A workplace where everyone has a voice, where everyone has the chance to succeed. And I promise to keep working to make sure it stays that way." Beyond the walls of Sterling Enterprises, the changes made by the company began to draw attention from the broader business community. Articles were published about the company's diversity initiatives, and Mark was invited to speak at conferences about the lessons he had learned. While he still struggled with his past mistakes, he used those experiences to connect with other leaders, encouraging them to examine their own biases and take responsibility for the cultures they created. Mark's own transformation was evident to everyone who worked with him. He no longer led from a place of ego or fear of change. Instead, he listened, really listened, to the people around him, especially those whose voices had been ignored for too long. It was a humbling process, but one that made him a better leader and, ultimately, a better person. James and Mark's relationship also evolved. While they would never be close friends, they found mutual respect in their shared commitment to making the company better. Mark often sought James's advice, and James appreciated the opportunity to influence decisions at the highest levels of the organization. One afternoon, during a quiet moment in the office, Mark approached James. "I've been thinking about that quote from the annual report," he said. "The one about lifting others up. It's something I wish I'd understood sooner, but I'm grateful you helped me see it." James smiled. "It's never too late to learn, Mark. The important thing is what we do with that knowledge." The ripple effects of the changes at Sterling Enterprises extended far beyond the company itself. Employees who had once felt invisible now felt seen and valued. Promotions and recognition were distributed more equitably, and the company's reputation as an inclusive workplace attracted top talent from across the industry. Aisha, James's mentee, was one of those who benefited from the mentorship program. Under James's guidance, she gained the confidence to take on more responsibilities and eventually led a project that landed a major client for the company. When she was promoted to team lead, James attended her celebration with pride, knowing he had played a small part in her success. The transformation at Sterling Enterprises became a blueprint for other companies, proving that meaningful change was possible with the right leadership and a commitment to fairness. The journey wasn't perfect, and there were still challenges to overcome, but the progress was undeniable. As James reflected on everything that had happened, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had started this journey with frustration and doubt, questioning whether he would ever be given the opportunities he deserved. But through perseverance, courage, and a willingness to push for change, he had not only transformed his own career but also helped create a workplace where others could thrive. On his desk, James kept a small framed card with the words he had once shared during the annual report. "Leadership isn't about titles, it's about lifting others up." It served as a daily reminder of the lessons he had learned and the responsibility he carried as a leader. James knew the journey wasn't over. There were still battles to fight, biases to confront, and systems to improve. But he also knew he wasn't alone. Together, with people like Mark, Aisha, and countless others, he was building something better. A workplace where everyone had the chance to rise.